Good morning and welcome to the Hearing Loss Association of America's Los Angeles chapter's Saturday morning meeting. And I'm Wendy Washington, the president of the chapter. And on behalf of our members, our steering committee, and myself, we'd like to welcome you to our meeting. Before we get started, I just want to say a couple of things for our local members in particular.
Okay, hold on.
That on next month, we will be resuming our Hope meetings. So put that on your calendar for October 26th, and there'll be more information to come. And our Hope meetings are very intimate and supportive and in person. So please put October 26th on your calendar for our Hope meeting. Our next Zoom meeting will be November 23rd, and Georgia can just shout out who will be here, what that meeting is about, if she can remember. And then last but not least, we'll be having our holiday party and celebrating our 20th anniversary in December, the weekend of the 14th, 15th. Those dates are being hashed out and all the details. So we hope to see people there. That is the only thing that I really need everyone to know at this point. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Georgia, our steering committee member, to introduce our speaker today.
Good morning, everyone from sunny Southern California. Sorry about the bad weather back east. I pray that this meeting goes well with Lisa and everybody back there. Okay, good morning. Our speaker today is Dr. Neil Bauman, founder of the Center for Hearing Loss Help. Is an expert in hearing loss, tinnitus, and musical ear syndrome, which we are going to hear about today. I have that for your information. With personal experience, severe hereditary hearing loss, and tinnitus, he has spent over 25 years educating and supporting people through his books, articles, and presentations. Dr. Neil has written over 11 books and over 1,000 articles on hearing-related topics. Welcome, Dr. Bauman.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and let's see if this works properly the way it's supposed to. Okay, and I'm going to move my camera over onto my other computer. There we are. We're all set to go. So good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. And I'm going to talk about a subject that I find utterly fascinating and one that few people openly talk about, or certainly have not in the past, for fear of being thought crazy. And that is the subject of hearing phantom sounds, such as musical ear syndrome and audio pareidolia. Now, here's a couple of examples. Harry writes, my wife hears music that is not there. The first song she heard was Silent Night, sung by a very good choir of mostly men. It came in quite loud. A day later, it was the Vienna Waltz, over and over and over again. So clear, it was like being at a musical production. And Janet explained, she said, my mother-in-law confided in me about hearing music loud and clear at various times of the day, but most frequently when she goes to bed, which is very common for musical ear syndrome. 2 doctors now have basically ridiculed her and said they'd never heard of such a thing. My mother-in-law is at the end of her rope. She is even accusing her husband of trying to drive her crazy by playing this music. And as you can imagine, this is very difficult on their marriage. So what do these 2 people have in common? Well, first, they hear strange phantom sounds that no one else hears. And second, they are both hard of hearing. And nor are they alone. Multiplied, thousands of people, especially hard of hearing people, hear similar phantom sounds, yet they never tell a soul because they are afraid of the dreadful H word, hallucinations. You see, for older people, the very word conjures up visions of phantom voices, padded cells, and people in white coats talking in hushed tones. And this is because almost everyone associates hearing voices with going crazy and mental illness. So what exactly are hallucinations? Hallucinations are where your brain perceives that something is happening, even though your five senses have not received any direct stimulus. In short, hallucinations are phantom sensations. Hallucinations may be visual or seeing, auditory or hearing, olfactory or smelling, gustatory or tasting, and tactile or feeling. Just looking at that lady, that's enough of a hallucination right there. Now, although hallucinations may occur with any of the five senses, auditory hallucinations are by far the most common kind. And hearing phantom sounds means that you are hallucinating. But don't get all in a tizzy, because not all hallucinations are a sign of mental illness. Some are, some aren't. So to start with, let's look at psychiatric auditory hallucinations. These are a sign of mental illness. And let's get that out of the way. And then we're going to talk about the other kind, the non-psychiatric. So we call these psychiatric auditory hallucinations. Now, schizophrenia is a common kind of psychiatric auditory hallucinations. See, schizophrenia is a mental disorder in which people interpret reality abnormally. And since schizophrenia may cause hallucinations, when people talk about hearing, phantom voices, doctors often immediately think that they have schizophrenia, because a lot of doctors don't know anything about MES and pareidolia. And did you know that schizophrenic-like systems can be brought on by taking one of the more than 600 different psychotropic and kindred drugs, such as antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs? And in such cases, the good news is when you stop taking the medication, your schizophrenic symptoms typically go away. So here's an example. One lady explained, my mom is 84 years old and has had a hearing loss for many years. This last year, she started hearing music and now hears voices. Initially, she shouted at them to go away, but now she seems to engage them. And she even yells at me, "Didn't you hear him? Can't you hear him?" My mom was put on Celexa for anxiety 4 weeks ago. This coincides with her beginning to hear voices. Now, citalopram, which is the generic of Celexa, the brand name, is one of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. And as you can see, they can and do cause auditory hallucinations. And then all too often, the person is diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And unfortunately, far too many people are diagnosed as having schizophrenia, when in reality, their psychosis, as the psychiatrist would say, is really a side effect of taking the drugs their doctors prescribed in the first place, not an underlying mental illness. But this does show how drugs can mimic mental illness or indeed induce mental illness. Now, in contrast to psychiatric auditory hallucinations, non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations are auditory hallucinations that happen to us normal. Put that in quotes, but we're mostly normal, and we're mostly hard of hearing people. Like I assume all of you guys are hard of hearing like me. And these kinds of hallucinations are not, I emphasize, are not a sign of mental illness or of taking psychotropic drugs, but rather they're a symptom of something not quite working right in the auditory circuits in our brains. So, of course, this begs the question, if you are hearing phantom sounds, how can you tell on the one hand whether it is a psychiatric auditory hallucination or a non-psychiatric auditory hallucination? Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, but here are two rules of thumb to help you distinguish the difference. People who experience psychiatric auditory hallucinations generally hear voices, whereas people who experience non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations mostly hear music or singing rather than just plain voices. And generally, the voices of people who experience the psychiatric auditory hallucinations almost always either talk to or about the person, and they engage the person in conversation. And consequently, the content is of a meaningful but often nasty personal nature. And in contrast, when people who experience non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations, when they hear voices, the voices often sound somewhat like a radio broadcast or a TV program playing over there in another room. The voices they hear do not contain any information of a meaningful personal nature. These voices neither talk to the person or about the person, and nor do they engage them in conversation. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about psychiatric auditory hallucinations. So if you just remember, if it's a personal nature, probably it's psychiatric, it's probably a sign of mental illness. If it's just sounds like impersonal stuff, somebody TV announcer announcing a ball game, TV show, things like that, or you hear music and it goes over and over and over again, then you know that is probably a non-psychiatric auditory hallucination. And this also is true for the audio pareidolia, which is just pure Greek, but anyway. Let's look at audio pareidolia before we get into musical ear syndrome. Audio pareidolia is actually, it's a most interesting phenomenon because people often confuse audio pareidolia with musical ear syndrome, and it's my fault for doing that because when I started studying this, I didn't know that there was these two different groups. And so I lumped the audio pareidolia in with the musical ear syndrome and called it musical ear syndrome. But they are not the same at all. You see, unlike MES, audio pareidolia sounds are not even hallucinations at all. They are illusions. And so I can hear you asking, what's the difference between a hallucination and an illusion? So here's a simple way to distinguish one from the other. Audio pareidolia, audio hallucinations, such as musical ear syndrome, are where you hear or perceive sounds that are not there. They're truly phantom sounds. They're not real sounds. Nobody else can hear them but you. And in contrast, auditory illusions, such as audio pareidolia, are where you hear a real sound. So it is a real sound. Typically, it's faint. It's more or less constant. It's in the background. But your brain perceives it as a totally different sound. Thus, other people may hear the same real sound you do, but do not necessarily perceive it as the same sound you're hearing. They may hear the real sound, and their brain interprets it as a real sound. Your brain may hear the real sound and interpret it as something else, and so that's what you hear. So let's look at how and why you may experience audio pareidolia. You see, your brain is an incredible, I mean, a really incredible pattern recognition machine. And it stores all the sound patterns you have ever heard since you were born in its database. See, it's right up to date. It's a computer and it's got a database with every sound you've ever heard. And when it receives a sound signal, it quickly searches through its database for that sound pattern. And if it finds a strong match, in other words, it's very similar, that's what you hear. You hear the sound pattern. Now, normally, your brain does an excellent job when it finds a strong match. And that is why you can easily understand me now as I am speaking, because the words I'm using, they have strong patterns in your brain, and so you know right away what I'm saying. However, sometimes your brain appears to have what I might call an overactive imagination, and the result is it does too good a job of finding patterns, and sometimes it finds patterns where none really exist, such as when you hear pseudo-random background sounds. For example, if there's just a hint of music or speech or singing in a continuous sound signal, that may be enough. Your brain searches through its database to find the best pattern. But the trouble is, it's a vague, ambiguous pattern. That's what it's hearing. So in the process of choosing the best pattern, your brain makes many assumptions as to which pattern is the closest. And then, get this, it force fits the incoming sound to this recognized pattern that has already gotten its database. However, because the pattern of the incoming sound is so big, it could fit any number of different stored patterns. So your brain just arbitrarily selects a pattern that it thinks is a possible fit, even if that pattern happens to be way out there in left field. And then it enhances this pattern. And it even fills in details to create the illusion of hearing a choir or orchestra or radio announcer or whatever it is from this continuous background sound. Now, examples of sounds that are commonly subject to audio pareidolia include fans, the most common one by far, fans, and motors, jet plane noise, wind and road noise when riding in a car, and even running water. Thus, you may have been hearing the faint background sound from your furnace fan, for example, that has just a hint of a pattern to it. Maybe the bearings on the fan are wearing a little bit, and there's just that hint of a pattern to it. Now, your brain can't tell what sound this really is because the pattern is so weak. So it selects what it thinks is a fairly good match. But since it has chosen a totally wrong pattern, instead of hearing a fan sound, you now perceive it as speech, a man announcing a ball game, or music, for example. Here's another example. A lady explained, my mom is hard of hearing. Recently, on a trip with my dad, she commented to my dad that when they arrived at their hotel, that she really enjoyed the music on the plane. Dad said, no music on the plane. On the return trip, Mom started hearing the music again and told Dad to listen. He said, no music. But Mom continued to enjoy it until the plane landed. Now, Jesus is a hard of hearing person, and the jet noise was loud enough. She could hear it. It was a constant background sound. She heard it and perceived it as music. Now, here's another example. This is from a hearing person. She says, I only perceive audio pareidolia when the furnace fan is running and I'm in bed and the house is quiet. It stops instantly when the furnace or air conditioning fan quits running. And that's a key. If it's audio pareidolia, as soon as the sound stops for whatever reason, it just disappears. It comes up again, you hear it again. So at this point, if you don't understand what is going on, you may think you're going crazy. I mean, you're truly hearing fan noise coming up from a hot air register or In the First Lady's case, a jet engine noise. But because your brain has selected the wrong pattern, you perceive it as a TV program or music or whatever, and that just freaks you out. So what can you do about it? Well, first recognize it for what it is. Your brain is trying to make sense out of what are basically pseudo-random background sounds. That's a mouthful. And second, don't worry that you're going crazy when you experience your furnace talking or singing to you. You're not crazy. You're just experiencing audio pareidolia. And after all, this is just part of being human. Well, that's all I'm going to say about audio pareidolia. Now we're going to turn our attention to the second kind of auditory hallucinations. We're going to be looking at non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations. Now, unfortunately, the general public immediately associates all auditory hallucinations, both the psychiatric and the non-psychiatric kind, with mental illness. You see, for example, if I say, I hear non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations, typically you will zero in on the two words psychiatric and hallucinations, and immediately you think I'm crazy. And as a result, few people have the courage to admit that they're hearing non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations for this very reason. For example, one lady explained, I was afraid I was going nuts. I never said one word to anyone about the strange music I was hearing because I didn't want them to think I was crazy. And because people know that I work with this and I won't laugh at them, they will share with me the things that they won't even tell their spouses. And because of this fear factor, many people describe their auditory hallucinations in terms such as musical tinnitus, to avoid using the word hallucinations. You see, we don't typically think of people with tinnitus as hallucinating or being nuts, do we? But truly, tinnitus is one kind of non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations. And because of this fear factor, there was and still is a real need for a term to describe non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations. Needs to be a name that has no negative connotations associated with it whatsoever, and one that does not include either the word psychiatric or hallucinations. And since the vast majority of people who experience non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations hear some sort of phantom music or singing, 20 years ago, way back in 2004, I coined the name musical ear syndrome for this condition. And not only does it not have any negative connotations, but it also sounds like it might be something good to have, like having an ear for music or maybe having perfect pitch. Say, for example, if I say, I've got musical ear syndrome, the first thing that comes to your mind is not that I'm crazy. You see, there's no stigma attached to the term to start with. You are left feeling neutral or maybe even slightly positive towards the term, or you query with an open mind. Musical ear syndrome? What's that? And since I coined the term musical ear syndrome, I have found that people are far more willing to openly talk about the phantom sounds they hear. In fact, about a decade or more ago, I did a search on Google for the phrase, in quotes, musical ear syndrome. And already by then, Google had come up with tens of thousands of web pages that use this term. You can't find that anymore because now Google only shows you 10 or 20 things. But back then, remember, it used to say how many web pages had it. So how do we define musical ear syndrome? Well, my definition is hearing non-tinnitus phantom sounds, that is, auditory hallucinations of a non-psychiatric nature, often musical, but also including voices and other strange sounds. Now, as I mentioned previously, some people call these MES sounds musical tinnitus, but that's not technically correct. See, although tinnitus sounds are truly non-psychiatric auditory hallucinations, I've never heard a person with tinnitus say, I'm hallucinating. But that is exactly what experiencing tinnitus means. And we don't refer to tinnitus sounds as auditory hallucinations because auditory hallucinations, remember, they got that bad press. And people would think that we're crazy and drag us off to the funny farm. And the same holds true if you're hearing audio pareidolia sounds. So how do you distinguish tinnitus sounds from MES sounds? Well, here's the simple way. Tinnitus sounds are single, simple, unmodulated sounds, such as ringing, buzzing, hissing, a roaring, clicking, humming, rushing, whooping, whooshing, droning, and kindred sounds. I mean, there's all kinds of tinnitus sounds. There's some of them that you might hear. And in contrast, musical ear syndrome sounds include multiple complex modulated sounds such as singing and music and voices. That's why if you're hearing music, it can't be tinnitus because it's modulated, because music is modulated. And incidentally, often these phantom sounds have a seasonal quality. Thus, people hear Christmas carols during the winter season, for example. One lady wrote, my 66-year-old mom lost almost all her hearing 2 months ago. The last 3 days, now this was written on December 28th of whatever year it was, she keeps hearing Silent Night and O Come All Ye Faithful over and over and over and over again. And in addition, people often hear patriotic songs, such as the Star-Spangled Banner around the 4th of July. And that's why we Americans often hear the Star-Spangled Banner. We Canadians, because I hold dual citizenship, typically hear God Save the Queen and Row Canada. And if you're Australian, you often hear their national anthem, Waltzing Matilda. Now, how common is musical ear syndrome? You see, because so few people admit to hearing phantom sounds, researchers consider musical ear syndrome, under whatever name they call it, as being very rare. But that is just not true. Musical ear syndrome is much more common than anyone seems to realize, especially the medical profession, and affects significant numbers of hard of hearing people. Now, for example, when I speak to groups of hard of hearing people on this subject, like I'm doing right now, I often ask how many people present have heard such phantom sounds or illusions. And since they feel safe with me, invariably 10 to 30% of the people present are brave enough to put up their hands and say, yeah, I can hear that. And that's just those that are willing to publicly admit they have heard such phantom sounds. Other people won't even say that much. I'm not going to do it today because I can't see you when I'm in presenting mode, so I wouldn't get the feedback anyway. But in my research to date, I've collected the stories of close to 2,000 people regarding their MES experiences. And this alone tells you just how common MES really is. Now let's look at some characteristics of people with musical ear syndrome. Okay, number one, often the person is older. About 2/3 of the people with MES are older than 50. About 1/3 are older than 70. And only about 1/3 of the people experiencing MES are younger than 50. But here's the caveat. Be aware that most of these younger people are not experiencing MES, but audio pareidolia, because they've got their good hearing. Second, generally, the person has some degree of hearing loss. You see, MES is often caused by a lack of auditory stimulation, just like tinnitus is. So it stands to reason that people with tinnitus almost always have some degree of hearing loss. Now, surprisingly, about a third of the people with MES report normal hearing. But as I've just said, these people almost always are experiencing audio pareidolia, not MES. And the reason for this is that if you don't have a hearing loss, you hear many faint background sounds that hard of hearing people don't hear. And if we don't hear them, we can't experience audio pareidolia at all. Because remember, it's always a real sound that we're hearing if you have audio pareidolia. The third characteristic is they're more commonly reported in women than men for some reason. Actually, typically 3 times as many women as men report hearing MES sounds. Now, this does not necessarily mean that more women than men experience musical ear syndrome, although it's quite possible they do. It just means that more women than men are willing to speak up and seek help. Number 4, commonly the person has some emotional problems. They're anxious, they're worried, they're stressed, they're depressed. And these emotions can bring on musical ear syndrome, just like it does tinnitus. You see, it seems often that people are going through anxious experiences and stressful situations, such as the death of a spouse or some sickness or problems in the family. They experience MES more often than people whose lives are moving along just beautiful and smoothly. And the same is true with depression. 1 out of 5 people experiencing MES admits to being depressed when their MES started. And this is exactly true for tinnitus. You're more likely to get tinnitus if you are depressed, 20% at least. Number 5, generally, I've got to put that slide up for you, but generally, people become aware that their sounds are phantom. If you've got MES, as time passes, hopefully you figure out that these can't possibly be real sounds. For example, one elderly lady who knew she was hearing a radio station, and she's hearing a radio station, and someone told me they even know the call letters, realized that radio stations don't play the same song over and over and over and over and over again endlessly. So if the music she is hearing repeats endlessly, she knows it's all in her head. She's got MES. Now, a man who also heard phantom sounds, he heard his while in bed. He had a different way of determining whether he was hearing real sounds or phantom sounds. He simply put the pillow over his ears. If he could still hear the sound just as loud, he knew it was all in his head. However, if the pillow cut out the sound or some of the sound, he knew it was real. And that worked for him. Now, probably about 15 to 20% of the people experiencing MES cannot tell the sounds they are hearing are truly phantom. These people are typically frail, meaning typically they're up in their 80s or 90s. And even when caregivers explain to them that these sounds are not real, they refuse to believe it because their only frame of reference to hearing voices is that they're crazy, and they don't want to admit to that. And as a result, if you insist that those are phantom sounds, they will become very angry at you because you're trying to tell them otherwise, and they start accusing you of being hard of hearing. And in my experience, it's almost impossible to help such people. They just refuse to admit it. And the best I can do is explain clearly to their children or their caregivers what is happening so that they can understand what the person is going through and run interference for them when the people, with the various people they come in contact with, the neighbors, or if they're in a condo or an apartment, the people next door, they wonder what's going on with this person. So having a caregiver explain that, they make allowance for it. And number 6, they may appear to act irrationally. See, if you have MES, to other people, you may appear to act irrationally, and then they're going to think, of course, that you're crazy. You see, when you can't separate your phantom sounds from real sounds, you will continue to act as though what you're hearing is real. I mean, that's obvious. It's just logical. But this gives rise to some bizarre and often what appears to be irrational behavior. But don't let that throw you. Now, unfortunately, because of their apparent irrational behavior, too often doctors and caregivers, which also includes family members, have quickly written such people off as being nuts and treat them as such when they are simply just being fooled by their MES. So let's look at 3 reasons why MES can completely trick you into believing that the phantom sounds you are hearing are real. So first, the sounds do seem genuine. As far as you're concerned, you are hearing them with your ears. It sounds like they're coming from your ears, not just sitting in your head some way. So no way could they be phantom, because they are coming up from your ears. And therefore, you treat them as real sounds. That is, before hopefully you realize that your brain is fooling you once again. Second thing, often the sounds have directionality. That is, they appear to come from a definite direction. They're not just in your head, like your tinnitus is sometimes. You know they're coming from a certain direction, from that house over there, from the apartment below you, or the apartment above you. Thus, they act like real sounds. And thus, it is most difficult to believe that these sounds are truly phantom, because they sure seem real. And although most people with MES may appear to have bizarre behavior, if you put yourself in their shoes, you'll quickly realize that they are behaving sanely and rationally based on what their senses are telling them. See, your senses is a perception. They're not real. Real sounds come and hit your eardrum. But what your brain perceives is the perception of what those sounds are. And so they're perceiving reality this way, and they act logically that way. And so even though the sounds you're hearing are phantom, you're going to act differently. A concerned neighbor explains it. She said, "We have a neighbor in our condo who has been fairly deaf for many years. He's about 80 now. And in recent years, he's hearing music, which he attributes to the neighbor next door, that neighbor that way. No one else in our condo has ever heard such music. It's quite quiet here at night, and he has enlisted the help of paralegals and others, demanding that the music stop. Our condo board is beside itself as his threats become more aggressive. He's making everyone's life miserable. And this man hears real music, and he knows exactly where it's coming from, that neighbor next door. So he does the rational thing and tries to get the condo board to stop it so he can get a good night's sleep. And when they don't, he enlists the help of a paralegal. And you see, to everyone else, he's acting irrational. It looks like he's crazy. But because the music is so real, it has directionality, and the condo board won't stop it, and the person next door won't stop, apparently, he takes legal action. Now, let's look at number 3. This is even puts the icing on the cake. These sounds may be accompanied by tactile sensations. For example, you might also feel the floor vibrating from all the racket you know is coming from that floor person living downstairs below you. And thus the person with MES may even make up totally illogical explanations to try to fit what you hear and what you're feeling into your reality. One lady wrote, this is a good one. My 90-year-old father-in-law has been hard of hearing for some time and is getting progressively worse. The geriatric psychiatrist tested him and found no dementia. He's sane. He mainly hears loud music when alone in his apartment, which is typical, oftentimes in the middle of the night. He thinks that the landlady, and in this case, the landlady lives directly below him, knows exactly when he lays down to go to sleep. And this gentleman, he's very regular. He goes to bed at 11 o'clock at night. And that is when this landlady turns the music all the way up. And unfortunately, he's taken to knocking on the downstairs landlady's door at 3 a.m. or whatever, telling her to turn down the music. She says, we've been with him a few times. When he heard the music, none of us heard anything. Now get this. He also believes she has a vibrating device that makes his floor vibrate. He's got the idea that she's got something like maybe a subwoofer that she attaches to the ceiling, and that vibrates his floor, which vibrates his bed, which shakes him. And he's getting tired of this. Now, feeling vibrations when you are hearing phantom sounds is not as rare as you might think. I've heard from numbers of people who experience vibrations along with their MES, and I get it regularly myself. And when you can both hear and feel these phantom sounds, and when they also have directionality, I mean, it's really difficult to believe these sensations are all phantom. And so that's why if you put yourself in their shoes, you realize they're totally rational, but their senses are fooling them. And finally, you've all heard stories of people who pick up radio stations supposedly through the dental fillings. And these stories have been around from the dawn of radio. I can remember my dad telling me such stories more than 60 years ago. And I know it's at least 60 years ago because he died at least 60 years ago. So in spite of the many reports of radio broadcasts being received through dental fillings, in all my research on the subject, and I've tried to find them, I have not found even one single proven case. People came up with this explanation in their desperate search for a rational explanation for the strange phantom radio sound, like sounds, you know, like an announcer at a ball game and so on, that they were hearing. And of course, hearing's in quotes. So they wouldn't have to admit they were crazy. This is why it's so important to get the word out that musical ear syndrome is nothing to worry about. When you hear such sounds, you're not crazy. You probably just have a hearing loss and your brain is interpreting things differently. Well, there you have it, folks. Due to time constraints, this has been a very, and I emphasize very, brief overview of musical ear syndrome and audio pareidolia. However, if you're interested, you can learn more about, much more actually, than what I've said in my book, Phantom Voices, Ethereal Music, and Other Spooky Sounds. And if you want to contact me, feel free to do so. Whoops, there's my contact information. Tim has all of this, so you don't have to write it down. You can get it from him after. Well, that's it. I'm gonna, whoops, what did I do here? Stop sharing. And now I am willing to answer any questions you might have about musical ear syndrome or anything else related to ears, because I have learned quite a bit here. Just put my camera back on this computer.
Hey, my name is Mark. Oh, is that
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Neil Bauman. And we do have a couple of questions. Georgia has her hand up, so we'll go to Georgia first.
Hi, I have a low level orchestra that goes on over and over again 24/7. When I got my first cochlear implant, my tinnitus went away. When I got my second cochlear implant, it came back. So this is since 2006. And I have a 24/7. It doesn't affect my sleep. But when I put my cochlear implant processors on, fortunately, the tinnitus, that low level orchestra goes away. So when I am home alone, I don't wear my cochlear implant processors because I don't want to. But my question for you is, does the mind get tired when it hears this constant, for me, this low level orchestra? It's just, over and over. I ignore it for the most part. So, but I'm just wondering if it makes you tired. So that's my question.
Well, I'm sure it can, because as far as your brain's concerned, it's real sound. And too much real sound makes you tired, and you're hearing this all the time. Because basically, if you want to think of it this way, your MES sounds are coming from memories in the memory circuits in your brain, and they're getting put into the auditory circuits where they're processed as real sounds. And so I would agree that it should make you tired if you've got it all the time. Too much noise is too much noise. That's when you yank your ears off. I take mine off and just, enjoy the silence. I'm so used to it. I just enjoy the silence. Okay,
Thank you.
anybody else?
Yes, we have Jackie next.
I have a question. Like, long story short, I had cancer. I had chemo that caused it was ototoxic. So I got ringing in my ears. In 15, I had moderate hearing loss, and I had a Baja, and I had tinnitus. And then in 2000, I went completely deaf. And well, in 19, I went completely deaf in my left, but I still had this like high pitched ringing that sounded like our tube system in the hospital. So I never heard the tubes come. But then when I went completely deaf in both ears, all of a sudden, and just like you said, I literally thought I was going crazy. Like, I would ask my husband, "Do you hear that?" And he said, "No." And for some reason, I don't get it during the day. Like when my one cochlear's on, only one works. But I only get it at night. It's very soft. And like you said, which is fascinating, that what it reminds me of is when I took a music class when I was going through my BSN, and I had to take a music art class or whatever as an elective. It sounds like that music. It's classical, mostly strings. At night when I sleep, it's faint. Sometimes it's Beastie Boys with drums and stuff, but it's no vocal. But do you know why it would go from ringing when I have moderate to being completely deaf, and then all of a sudden hearing music when my cochlear's off? Like, why would it go from ringing to music?
Well, that's quite often, actually, people seem to get musical ear syndrome comes out of tinnitus. So they've got tinnitus first, and then they get the musical ear syndrome. And for some people, what happens, remember I was telling you that a lot of times it repeats over and over. And there's one progression that a number of people have had where they hear a song that they knew, maybe like a Christmas carol or something, and their MES plays the whole thing. And then it goes long and shortens it down to takes a verse off, and then takes another one and another one off, and then you only get one verse, and then it starts taking lines off until you only got one line, and then it starts shortening it down and takes bars off until you've only got one bar, say 3 notes, just repeated endlessly. And then for some people, that progression, then it fades back into their tinnitus that they had to start with.
Like
So,
I have no ringing ever. It's always, I couldn't even tell you the classical. I just know it's strings because it's not drums. And I even asked my popular rep why, and she gave me a book that, like, this was probably 4 years ago, to read up on it. But it's so weird. I mean, it's comforting because it's like, and it's low. I don't get the vibrations, but it's just weird that it went from tinnitus to musical ear syndrome, like for no reason. I mean,
well,
it's
there
relaxing,
doesn't seem to be reasons for a lot of times, when you have it.
but
I mean,
okay.
you're just different than everybody else because everybody is
That's true.
unique with this. I mean, you don't hear my kind of musical ear syndrome or my kind of audio pareidolia, and I don't hear yours. And, they come and go. Some people, they have it 24/7 and never goes. A lot of people, they get it at night when they lay down to go to sleep because it's quiet. They're not focused. They're basically letting their brain go to sleep, so
Yeah,
to speak.
mine is whenever my cochlear is off, like in the middle of the day. Like I've had
Yeah.
MRIs. I
Well,
was
if
like,
you
I
if you
don't need
take your
music.
cochlear implant off, then your brain is not getting the stimulation it was just when you had it on, and so then it starts making up its own stuff.
Gotcha.
So at this point,
Interesting.
I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their questions. We
Okay.
have a few more people. So, and then of course, Dr. Neal's information is available for people to follow up after the meeting. But let's have Tim. He has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Neal. This is pretty fascinating. I did want to ask you, what role do you think hearing aids might play in this? And what I mean, for example, is we have a refrigerator, it's got a loud fan. And with my hearing aid, I can make all sorts of adjustments and I can make that fan sound very, very different and not even realize it. For example, I could be at a restaurant and have a setting to reduce background noise and forget to change it. I come home and I'm sitting down and I'm like, what is this? And then I realized later it actually is a sound. But I'm just wondering in general, can hearing aids or assistive devices that can change the nature of the sounds and the pitch and all that cause any of these sort of musical ear syndromes or anything like that to happen?
I don't know whether they do. I mean, wearing hearing aids, cochlear implants, Bahas, and so on gives your brain real sounds to hear, and that's makes your brain happy. So for a lot of people, that's fine. They take their cochlear implant or hearing aids off at night. There's their musical ear syndrome comes up and amuses them all night long or annoys them, whichever. And when they get up and start doing something in the morning, now all of a sudden your brain wakes up. You've got focus on other things. It's not quiet, and it goes away. So, but not everybody. Some people hear it during the day, but then maybe they live in a quiet place. And if their spouse died and they're living alone, they have nobody to talk to. I mean, why even bother putting your hearing aids on or your CI? And so your brain is starved for sound and you get your musical ear syndrome sounds.
Thank you for that. Mark has a question.
Thanks. Thanks so much for this topic. I have a situation where it's only when I play music. So I'm deaf in both ears. So I only have one cochlear implant, but my perception, somehow my brain feels like I can hear in both ears, but that's not possible. But I think it's more on a vibrational level. So I can feel the vibration, but to me, it makes sense that it's the same thing. And I get the same effects as I would when I used to hear it. And so when I was losing my ability to hear, I would continue to listen to classical music, but I think I was sensing it more. I would hear what I could, but it was getting less and less. But I would start to sort of sense and enjoy the music. So that's why it's almost like it's all in sync, but I'm not really hearing it, because it's not possible. So I don't know if this is related, but it's just with music, I hear it and then I turn it off, then it stops. It doesn't continue like some of the ways that you mentioned. So I wondered if you had any feedback on that.
As I say, everybody is different. And I've, talked to thousands of people about this and trying to find something, there's always somebody comes up with something new that I hadn't heard before. I do know that, like, if you hear music and if you've been in a symphony, or any loud concert, and you feel the vibrations. And if you see somebody whacking away on a big drum, you know that there's vibrations. And because you could hear before. And so there's vibrations associated with the sound. And so your brain automatically adds feelings and sensations to it. For example, I hear a rumbling sound. It sounds like a big bulldozer is just right outside my window. Now, I've been around the heavy machinery, and I know when a bulldozer is going, that you can feel the ground shaking if you're only 10 feet away. And you do. So when I hear that, my brain associates that with it being a bulldozer, and I feel the house shaking. I feel my chair shaking, and it shakes me, even though I look out there and there's nothing there. And that happens. Your brain really fools you. And it took me a while because this happened long before I'd ever got into this subject. And so I didn't know anything about it. But I could be sitting in my car at the parking lot waiting for my wife. And I hear the motor purring along, and I can feel the car shaking in unison with the motor idling. But the truth is, the keys are in my hand. The motor isn't running at all. Not only that, I can't hear the motor anyway. I'm deaf. And yet I feel it. Wife comes back and she gets in the car and I tease her, and I say, you feel the car shaking? And of course you don't. It's all sensation. So I've learned that a lot of things you have to discount. They're not real. And it's just the way your brain works. It's not right or wrong. Okay, somebody else got a question, or we ran out? I don't see.
I wanted to see if Allison had a question. She had her hand up, and then Allison, are you here?
Yes, hi. I was
Yeah,
having trouble because I had a lot of noise going on in the background.
okay.
Thank you, Dr. Bauman. I'm fascinated. I'm both personally as well as professionally as a psychologist. And what I have found is I have tinnitus every morning when I wake up until I put my hearing aids in. So the question I have is really more of a clinical one, in that, as you said, that you see a lot of people with tinnitus tend to be more anxiety and depression. Are there actually statistics about that? Or what has been your experience about that?
I've seen some statistics, and somewhere I had on the slide, how many people had various ones.
I mean,
Yeah, so I get statistics from various places, and then other ones are just my own personal experience. I see the people that come to me have,
okay. Let me clarify. In your experience, what do you see, about 50-50? Where there's anxiety and depression with it? Or I'm just wondering, because tinnitus I find it to be very common. And I just wonder, in your experience, how much do you see with anxiety and depression with it?
Well, it's hard, because sometimes, it's which came first, the chicken or the egg. The people that are depressed can get tinnitus because the depression triggers it. But I get so many people that get tinnitus and it just won't go away, and it's really loud, and they're really feeling bad. And so then they get anxious because they won't go away. They get depressed. Is this going to last forever? And the first thing I do when people come to me, usually they will phone me, and they may phone me, and the first words out of their mouth are, I've got tinnitus, it's driving me buggy, and I want to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
have to figure out what they have, and then I have to build hope in them that
Yeah.
it's not a lifetime sentence. I mean, it is in one sense. I mean, I've had tinnitus for, well, I can remember for at least 75 years that I've had tinnitus, but you can see it doesn't bother me. I don't care. And I get show them that I can live with it. They can learn to do the same thing, and I teach them how to do it. And by the end of a phone call, which is typically 2 hours, they're laughing and joking with me. Where they started out, they were just so overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
And so it works both ways. If you are depressed or anxious, doesn't necessarily start tinnitus, but you have some other trigger that started it, like you took a drug, or you loud concert or loud music or whatever, and then with these other emotional factors, it just makes it worse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that question. Thank you, Dr. Neal, for this wonderful presentation. We are out of time, but it has been a very insightful, informative morning. I know that people still have questions. I encourage you to use the contact information that has been provided to continue to reach out and be in communication with Dr. Neal. He has books, he has answers, and so please use that information.